When a black guy walks into a bank, a racist bank manager notifies security right away, thinking he is up to no good. The manager is slapped with karma the next time he sees the black man enter the bank. Malcolm Avery entered the cold air conditioning. A pleasant respite from the blazing heat outdoors, dressed in a neat white shirt and cut black pants, Malcolm handled himself with calm confidence. Glass panels slid open. His well-groomed beard and deliberate demeanor exuded professionalism. He went to the counter. A young Latina teller, Angela Ramirez, welcomed him with a kind grin. "Good afternoon, sir. How may I help you today?" Her fingers were lingering. Malcolm slipped the type of check that would brighten anyone's day over the desk with a little nod. Over the keyboard, he produced a check from the pocket of his blazer, smooth and slightly stiff. Angela looked at. Her tone was polite and professional. She started putting in information. Her eyes scanned the computer screen. Malcolm observed silently. He wasn't one to flaunt his. She lifted eyebrows slightly. Achievement. Yet this check showed months of hard effort on a design project that had finally paid off. A little grin tugged at his lips. Everything appeared to be going perfectly until a shadow fell over the counter. "Excuse me, Angela, Malcolm turned to see a tall white guy coming wearing a suit that seemed more costly than it should have been. His name tag said, Jeffrey Collins, manager, and the air surrounding him, a voice said smooth and authoritative, appeared to change with almost undetectable tension. Jeffrey walked in front of Angela, softly pushing her aside. Angela paused, her fingers still on the computer. "I nearly processed Mr. Collins," I responded. "I'll handle it, Jeffrey." Cut her off, his tone still courteous but strong. He gave her a look that hushed any further protest. Angela moved back unwillingly, giving Malcolm a fleeting, regretful glance. Before withdrawing, Malcolm's grin faded something about. The manager's abrupt involvement didn't set well with him. He straightened up and watched Jeffrey closely as the guy picked up the check and scrutinized it excessively. "This is quite a lot," Jeffrey murmured, his eyes. Malcolm scowled. "You wouldn't see checks like these every day. I earned a valid check." "I'm sure you did," Jeffrey said, but his tone suggested something different. I dropped the check down. Malcolm's grasp tightened on the edge of the counter, and you know that when we witness anything like this, we have to ask questions. Malcolm's arms were slightly bent forward. Malcolm said, attempting to keep his voice low. Jeffrey bent his head slightly and smiled, weak and unconvincingly. "Where did the check come from? What sort of business do you perform to get this kind of payment? Even if it's cash for a project." I finished. Jeffrey didn't move. He watched Malcolm for a long period, as if deciding whether to trust him. The grin stayed pasted on his face, but it seemed more like an MK ask than anything. "Although the air conditioning documents the check itself as evidence, I see, and the firm that issued this check, do you have any documentation proving the validity of the transaction?" Malcolm felt a cold go through him. "The bank can confirm it." Jeffy's eyes narrowed ever so much, of course, but you know we have had cases when individuals have attempted to pass off dubious checks. It's crucial to ensure everything is correct. Above board, the basic meaning in Jeffy's remarks struck Malcolm like a slap. He wasn't just asking questions. He was indicating something else Malcolm had heard before in various forms in different locations, but it always boiled down to the same thing. You wouldn't belong here. You couldn't have earned this. Malcolm took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Look, I'm here to deposit a check," that's all Jeffy's grin. "I'm not sure what you're trying to convey. I'm just checking sure everything is in order." Fading, the courteous veneer slid slightly, and something colder took its place. Malcolm could feel the gaze of other bank customers on him now. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and his heart accelerated, but he understood where this was heading. He pushed himself to remain cool. He handled such circumstances previously and wouldn't allow this guy entice him into a conflict here. "You can check it," Malcolm repeated. "Strongly, I'm not going until you do." Jeffrey raised an eyebrow, his eyes blazing with displeasure. Sir, I advise you reduce your tone. Malcolm opened his lips to argue, but before he could finish, Jeffrey snatched the check in his palm. He folded his arms, moving back slightly. I believe we should investigate this. Jeffrey said, his voice now completely devoid of any friendliness he indicated toward the rear of the bank. If you would just wait. Here for a while, Malcolm looked toward the entrance where 2 security guards stood close by, their eyes focused on him. His pulse hammered in his chest, and he felt the irritation. He disliked the way things was going. Rising, he understood precisely what was occurring, and it had nothing to do with the check, as Jeffrey left with the check in hand. Malcolm leaned against the counter, forcing himself to breathe slowly. This was far from over. Malcolm watched Jeffrey go into the rear of the bank, the check still in his palm. The air around him seemed heavy, laden with the weight of presumptions and silent accusations. His fingers softly tapped on the counter as he looked at. I'm very sorry about this. I've seen you around here before, and I have never seen anything. Angela, who stood behind the counter, clearly showed him her unease. Her voice dropped. Like this happened with your trans activities. Malcolm appreciated her effort to clear things up, but it didn't help. He nodded slightly but said nothing. His eyes flickered towards the security guards at the door again, one of them a tall. Twisted minutes passed. The conversation of the bank's other patrons seemed like background noise. Muscle Guy looked in his direction, then muttered softly into his walkie-talkie. Seemed like an intentional delay, an implicit choice to question not only the check, but also the thought that he might be questioned for just being. Remote and unimportant to the stress building within him every second that passed. Here at this time noted him. Then, just as Malcolm was going to reach the counter, Jeffrey returned. The expression on his face had changed. There was the thin shell of civility in place instead. Something sharper, colder, and unyielding. Jeffrey placed the check on the counter, but his palm stayed on top of it, as if he was defending it. I chose to personally handle this, as my eyes met Malcolm's with almost physical force. Malcolm blinked his irritation. There's something about this check that just doesn't sit right with me. His voice is calm, but oozing with disdain. His fury began to boil just under the surface. Leaning forward, though his remarks were plain, what precisely is it about the check that doesn't sit well with you? Jeffy's demeanor changed. I believe you know what I'm talking about. His voice dropped significantly. Malcolm's jaw clenched. No. I'm not sure. Why don't you tell me, Jeffrey? Let's not play games, Mr. Avery. His lips twisting into something that could have resembled a grin, though it didn't reach his eyes. This size well? Malcolm inquired, the edge in his voice clearly evident, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, although he kept them under control. This size? Well, we have protocols in place for circumstances like this. Jeffy's hand eventually removed from the check, but instead of returning it, he crossed his arms. This is rare for someone like you come in with a check this size. We need make sure it is not false. Malcolm glanced at someone like you. He understood exactly what Jeffrey meant. He had dealt with this before, delicate phrases that conveyed a not-so-subtle meaning. You're blaming me. His pulse was pounding, his breath short. I'm not accusing anybody of anything, Jeffrey said smoothly, but the smile on his face indicated otherwise. Malcolm inquired, his voice calm, but tinged with fury. He couldn't believe how rapidly this was developing. Malcolm sneered. I've been banking here for years. You can check my account records. I have never had a problem. We should be careful managing such big quantities of money. Times change procedures. Therefore, this check, it simply doesn't add up. Malcolm took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. What doesn't add up is why you're treating me like a criminal attempting. The two guys stared each other down. The tension was evident now, catching the attention of other customers and staff. Angela was obviously uncomfortable. To deposit money that I earned, the temperature in the room appeared to decrease. Jeffrey straightened, his grin gone now. I urge you calm down, Mr. Avery. There's no need for hostility. Malcolm replied, his voice rising slightly, from foot to foot behind the counter, uncertain of what to do. Jeffrey's tone implied the exact opposite. But if you can't confirm where this check came from, I'm simply trying to understand why you're accusing me of something I haven't done. Malcolm's heart hammered in his chest. His irritation was approaching its breaking point. He felt the eyes of the security personnel on him once again. Every word he said carried judgment. It was unavoidable. I don't need to confirm anything, Malcolm said. His voice is cool and steady now. The same tale repeated over and over, doubt, mistrust, and assumptions based on the color of his skin. The check is legitimate. Phone the business and verify it. Jeffrey, plainly displeased. That's not how we do things here. We'll be clinging on the check for further inspection. Malcolm's fist tightened once again, and he pushed himself to remain cool even though it was taking every ounce of control he had. You're not holding on to anything. You're going to deposit that check. Jeffy's eyes darkened. Sir, if you continue to behave this way, I'll have no option but order security to remove you from the grounds. Malcolm gazed at him, the wrath boiling under the surface. I'm not going until you deposit my check. An uncomfortable stillness followed, and for a while neither man moved. Then Jeffrey took a cautious, calculated step backward, his hand up. Slightly as he turned over Malcolm's shoulder, security, he called, his voice quiet but forceful. Malcolm turned just in time to see the two security officers approach their faces. Unreadable, his pulse raced, but he refused to back off. Jeffrey replied, his voice low. Down, he wasn't going to let them bully him about. I'm giving you one more opportunity to go quietly. Malcolm took a long breath, his hands trembling with the weight. This was about the ongoing need to show himself, to justify his presence in environments that considered him as less than, not simply about the check anymore. I'm not leaving, Malcolm said firmly. I'm staying right here until you finish. Jeffy's eyes blazed with wrath, and he gestured toward the soldiers escorting him out before Malcolm could respond. The guards were on him, seizing his arms and dragging him toward. Malcolm's voice came out strong and relentless. You're going to regret this. His heart hammered in his chest as he battled their hold. The humiliation was rushing over him like a wave. Jeffrey watched at the door, seeing with icy enjoyment. As Malcolm was tossed into the pavement, the doors slammed shut behind him. Malcolm's chest rose and fell as he stood outside the bank, the summer heat prickling at his skin. He changed his shirt and walked in fury, still trying to understand what had just occurred. People staring at him curiously, but he didn't care. His head ran with wrath and incredulity. How could anything as easy? Turning his check into this inside the bank, he could see Jeffrey standing at the door, the arrogant expression on his face causing Malcolm's fury to boil. Malcolm's blood boiled. He wanted to march back in and demand that his. Malcolm held his position outside the door, breathing hard to calm himself. His phone rang in his pocket, and he took it out momentarily. He knew the security officers would be on him in seconds. Looking back to the bank, staring at the screen, seemed little in comparison to the hurricane whirl within him. Angela Ramirez, the teller who had first attempted to assist, caught his attention. She seemed somewhat ashamed, but unable to follow his advice as she knew the situation was wrong, but there was only so much she could do against someone like Jeffrey before Malcolm could decide. Jeffrey adjusted his suit jacket, behaving as like he owned the pavement just as much as he did the bank. His next movement, the bank's door slid open, and Jeffrey walked out. His shiny shoes clicked on the pavement. Mr. Avery, Jeffrey stated, his voice was condescending. I thought we made it plain inside your check isn't being deposited till we verify everything you could come back from. Later if you want. But creating a fuss out here isn't going to alter anything. Malcolm clenched his teeth, pushing himself to be cool, though his fury was obvious in every breath he took. This isn't about the check, and you know it. Jeffrey asked, an eyebrow, pretending to be innocent. Oh, what do you think it is about when you saw a black guy go into your bank with a large check and you determined that there is no way it could be true? Malcolm continued, his voice low. But Strong, that's what this is about. Jeffy's face stiffened. Watch your tone, Mr. Avery. I don't enjoy being accused of something that has no basis in reality. There's no foundation in reality for either what you're doing to me either. Malcolm said, I came in to deposit a check, and now I'm being treated like a criminal. You're being treated according to our policies, Jeffrey said smoothly. We have procedures in place for verifying large sums of money you of all people should realize that. Of all people, Malcolm repeated his voice. Rising, you mean black people, right? That's what you're trying to imply. Jeffy's brows tightened, but he maintained his cool face. Sir, you're making this about race, but that's not what's happening here. I'm just following the guidelines that don't seem to apply when someone else goes in with the same check. Malcolm refuted. I have seen individuals leave that bank with much more than I am requesting, and you didn't even blink, Jeffrey. I advise you to leave before this becomes worse for you. You're disturbing others, and I wouldn't hesitate to call the police if you did. His eyes hardening. Keep bringing up the cops like a bucket of icy water, but it didn't stop him, if anything. Rather, it stoked his wrath even more. I'm not backing down after everything that has already transpired, said his voice firm. You may call anyone you want, but I'm not going to allow you treat me like this. Jeffy's smile returned and he stepped back, folding his arms over his chest. Fine. Have it your way. Malcolm's pulse raced as Jeffrey took out his phone, dialing a number with intentional slowness. He could hear the faint sound of the phone ringing, then a little pause before Jeffrey responded. Yeah, this is Jeffrey Collins at First National Bank. I have a dilemma here. Malcolm could not believe what he was hearing. His body stiffened as Guy refused to leave after making commotion inside the bank. I think it would be better if an officer came by to address the matter. Jeffrey finished the conversation and pocketed his phone, turning back to show a pleased grin, as if challenging him to do something about it. It seemed as though the manager had been waiting for this moment. Malcolm shook his head, amazement flooding him. This isn't over. You'll regret this. Jeffrey laughed softly, the sound infuriatingly arrogant. You have made your point plain, Mr. Avery. Malcolm turned away, pacing once more as he attempted to gather his thoughts. He could see people inside the bank talking among themselves. Some of them appeared worried, others intrigued, but none of them. Suddenly, the whole globe seemed like it was closing in on him, like he was being driven into a corner. He couldn't escape from the seconds past, and soon Malcolm heard the clear sound of sirens in the distance. His gut. Malcolm prepared himself for what was coming next. The sirens stopped suddenly. He nodded with dread, but kept his head held high. He wouldn't let Jeffrey or anyone else deprive him of his dignity. Cut short, as the police vehicle drew up to the curb, Malcolm stood still, his pulse racing in his chest. Two uniformed officials emerged from the car. One was tall and broad-shouldered, while the other, a little shorter, wore an expression. Jeffrey stood off to the side, arms crossed over his chest. Their eyes concentrated on Malcolm as if he were already guilty. That could only be characterized as tired indifference. Each of them advanced with slow, methodical movements. Twisted into a smug grin, he gave the police a little wave, motioning toward Malcolm, as if he were passing on a problem that needed to be dealt with. Officers. Jeffrey said, his voice smooth and calm. This is the guy I called you. Apparently he was inside the bank, creating a disturbance, and refused to leave after we asked him many times. I would appreciate if you could handle the matter. The taller of the two, Police Officer Daniels, shifted his attention to Malcolm, measuring him in a manner that made Malcolm's skin crawl. Genuine. Daniels questioned, his voice bland. Malcolm opened his lips to reply, but the frustration and fury that had been rising within him all day caused his comments come out more precisely than expected. It's not true. All I did was attempt to deposit a check. This man chose to accuse me of fraud for no apparent reason. Daniels arched an eyebrow, peering across at Jeffrey, who... Malcolm's hands clenched at his sides, but he pushed Jeffrey. He gave a little shrug and remarked, his voice sickeningly cool. We have procedures for circumstances like these. He refused to participate. This is all about him not thinking I could have that sort of money Officer Daniels traded. He should take a big breath, and the check is legitimate if he calls the corporation that provided it. Turn back to Malcolm, sir. I'm going to ask you to move aside while we sort this out, but for now, I need you to calm down. His companion, Officer Green, gave a little nod as if to say, "Let's get this over with, Daniels." Malcolm's irritation bubbled over. "I am calm," he responded, though the stress in his voice showed him. "I have been calm this whole time." He pointed at Jeffrey, who was smugly attempting to spin this into something it is not. Daniel's countenance remained impassive, but his hand slipped toward the radio fastened to his shoulder. "I need you to step away from the building, sir. If you don't cooperate, we will have to take you in again." His voice forceful this time. Malcolm's eyes became wide with incredulity. "Take me in for what?" Attempting to cash a check, Officer Green moved closer now. "Your stance seems strained. You may comply, or we can escalate this." Malcolm felt imprisoned. He turned from the cops to Jeffrey, coldly satisfied, back to the cops once his heart hammered in his chest. He knew there was no winning here. The odds were stacked against him. Malcolm lifted his hand slightly, stepping back fine. If he disobeyed, he would wind up in jail or worse. "I will move aside, but this is wrong, and you know it." Officer Daniels nodded toward the... Malcolm moved away gently, going toward the location where Daniels had indicated. His head raced, fury still coursed through him. He had done nothing wrong, but here he was over there, sir, and not moved till we told you differently. Jeffrey walked forward once again, his face still twisted into that arrogant smile. He was being treated like a criminal, just for sticking his position. "Thank you, policeman. I'm sure you'll settle this out fast." The cops hardly regarded him as. Green walked closer to Malcolm, observing him closely, as if expecting him to make a mistake at any moment. They turned their gaze back to Malcolm. Daniel whispered into his radio, asking for assistance. His fists closed his thoughts, the humiliation overpowering him. He could see the looks of the passers-by, silent judgment in their eyes. He was just another black guy making disturbance. They lacked the knowledge and truth. "You're going with us," he stated simply. Malcolm's eyes widened. What for? They most likely didn't care after what seemed like an eternity. Officer Daniels approached once again. "For now, you're being held, Malcolm." What Daniels neglected flinch. "We have a complaint from the bank manager that you refused to leave the premises and made disruption. We will resolve everything out at the station." Officer Green stepped up behind him, and before Malcolm could object more, he felt the cold steel of handcuffs. I couldn't believe what he was hearing. He'd done nothing wrong. His pulse raced as he snapped around his wrists, but he pushed himself to remain as calm as he could. "Let him go." Daniel replied his tone, leaving little room for debate as they took him towards the police vehicle. Malcolm turned to stare at Jeffrey. Malcolm stated, his voice quiet, but full with fury. Jeffrey shrugged. Last time, the arrogant expression on the manager's face had not disappeared. In fact, it seemed to have intensified, as though he was loving every second of this. "You are going to regret this." One thing was clear. The cops took Malcolm into the rear of the vehicle, and the door slammed shut behind him as the car moved away from the curb. Malcolm's thoughts flew. He wasn't sure what would happen next. Malcolm's wrists shackled behind him, still attempting to get his head around what had just transpired. This fight wasn't over the journey to the police station. He could not shake the picture of. Malcolm was carried away, and Jeffy's arrogant face reflected the same expression he had seen too many times in his life from those who didn't expect someone like him to succeed, and who delighted in watching him fail. It was the cold satisfaction in his eyes. The antiseptic fragrance of the station made everything seem surreal, like he had entered another universe, one where justice. When the police vehicle at last arrived into the station, the cops lead Malom into the brilliant fluorescent lights. Daniel stated, his tone remained icy distant. Malcolm did as he was instructed. He was a twisted joke, Officer Daniels LED. Malcolm, signaled for him to wait here. Mind racing, his wrist ached from the cuffs. The physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation he watched as Daniels and Officer Green proceeded toward a desk where a police sergeant sat silently as Malcolm waited. He couldn't help but hear portions of their discussion, words like deception and disruption, floating through the air, kindling his wrath again. The more they spoke, the more it became evident Jeffrey had twisted the narrative to create. Malcolm changed in his seat, his irritation growing with every second he wanted to yell, to demand that someone listen to him. But now the cops were buying it without inquiry. Minutes passed. Understood that any indication of hostility would just make matters worse. He had to be clever. He sat down across from Malcolm, gazing at him with that clutching a clipboard and a stack of papers. Same apathetic face. "We're going to take your statement," Daniel said, turning over the papers on the clipboard. "You'll get an opportunity to explain your side of things." Malcolm's jaw clenched. "Explain my side." "I didn't. I went into the bank to deposit a check, and your pal Jeffrey decided I didn't belong there." Daniels hardly responded. "The manager has a different version of events. He says you refused to comply and created a scene when asked to leave, refused to cooperate." Malcolm's voice rose despite his attempts to keep cool. "He accused me of attempting to deposit a bogus check. I didn't make a scene, I defended myself from his falsehoods." Daniel sighed, his voice, expression unchanged. "We'll call the business that gave the check. If everything checks out, you'll be free to leave. But until then, you need to cool up and follow the procedure." Malcolm's hands tightened into fists behind his back, frustration bubbling over once again. "This is absurd. You are treating me like a criminal just on one man's claim. You haven't even bothered to confirm the facts we are now working on." Daniel remarked, his tone almost robotic, glancing at Malcolm. Wanted to get through this. He needed to remain cool no matter how frustrating. The Officer Green had returned to the desk, was already dialing a number on the phone. He took a long breath, attempting to stabilize himself. Predicament. He could only hope that after the business verified the validity of the check, this dream will go while Green made the call. Malcolm sat in quiet, his thoughts racing. He wondered how many more individuals had been in his path, positioned those unfairly accused their dignity, stripped away by someone who thought the worst of them. He had worked too hard, suffered too much to be reduced to this. Minutes passed, and Malcolm's heart sped as he watched Green on the phone, nodding sometimes, jotting notes onto a pad of paper. Every second seemed like a lifetime, the anxiety biting at him. What if they discovered a way to use this against him? Keep him here longer. He couldn't get rid of the sense that the deck was set against him. Eventually, Green shut up the phone and went over to Daniels, giving him the papers Daniel had examined. His demeanor changed. "Unreadable, the check is valid." Daniel stated bluntly, "The business certified the money was provided to you for services performed." Malcolm released a breath he hadn't known he was holding, but it was. Driven by the still-burning rage in his chest, this never should have occurred in the first place. "So now," Malcolm said, his voice laced with hate. Daniels nodded slightly to Green, who came forward and unlocked. Malcolm stroked his painful wrist slowly. "That's all after all. You'll be given a ride home if you need it." "You're free to leave," Daniel remarked, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. Malcolm felt his wrists. "Step out here." Daniels didn't flinch. "The check was genuine. You're not being charged with anything." Malcolm gazed at, shocked. "That doesn't alter what occurred. Jeffrey lied and you all believed him without question." Daniels. Malcolm shook his head. "This isn't over." His eyes strayed to the floor. There was no apology, no recognition of the injustice that had been done. Past the officials and out of the station, his body felt heavy, weighted by all he had undergone, but his mind was already churning, already planned. The next steps, he wasn't going to let this slip. Not this time, Malcolm. Sitting on his living room sofa, gazing at his phone, the words from the article he had just read danced around in his thoughts. The narrative was out there, but it was still little, simply a fleeting reference in a local outlet hardly touching the surface of. The bank's comment on looking into the problem didn't feel right with him. He understood how these things worked, so let things blow out, and Jeffrey would remain in his post. Smug and unrepentant. His thoughts raced as he considered what to do next. He had already gone through enough, brought into the police station, humiliated in front of everyone at the bank, and made to establish his innocence over a basic check. It was more than just him now. It was about ensuring Jeffrey Collins did not get away with what he had done, not just for his own dignity, but also for others who could suffer the same treatment. Malcolm grabbed his phone and looked through his contacts. One person he knew might assist: Rebecca Cole, a local investigative reporter known for covering racial injustices they had personally seen once at A. Malcolm phoned her number. The phone rang twice before a brisk professional answered. Rebecca Cole spoke hello. She had given him her card, stating if he ever had a tale to share with her. Rebecca, this is Malcolm Avery. I remember you. Malcolm interrupted, her tone softening. How have you been? Have you been coping with significant difficulty? Malcolm took a long breath and started the narrative. Not great. Something you may be interested in. He detailed everything that had transpired in the bank, how Jeffrey Collins had accused him of fraud, how he had been hauled out by security, how the police had been involved, how even. Rebecca listened carefully, only asking a few clarifying questions as Malcolm vividly described the events in vivid detail. Once it was all proved fake, the bank just promised a meager investigation. Malcolm, this is a tale people need to hear. This isn't just about a mistake at a bank. It's about systematic racism and the misuse of power. I can have a crew meet you. The time he finished, her voice was strong and resolute. Malcolm paused, but only for a second. He knew that going public would be difficult, but keeping quiet felt worse. Tomorrow morning we will record your side of the tale. Are you okay appearing on camera? Great, Rebecca replied. I'll manage the rest. We want to make sure this tale doesn't vanish. The following morning, Malcolm found himself standing in front of the bank, where it had all gone down. People should know what occurred. Rebecca was next to him in a notepad, gently chatting to him about what to anticipate during the interview. The early light glinted off the glass front, casting a chill. The camera team was setting up nearby, mirror of the place that had become a battleground for his dignity once the camera was running. Malcolm spoke. He recounted his narrative again, this time for the world to hear. He didn't hold back. He discussed Jeffrey Collins' darkly disguised racism, how he had been hauled to the police station without any genuine reason. He detailed the humiliation, the aggravation, and the indisputable sensation he had been targeted only because of. The claim of fraud was bogus. Rebecca answered questions, leading the conversation, but it was Malcolm's voice that carried the weight after the interview ended. Rebecca reassured him it would be on the evening news and that they were going to. The hue of his skin. Malcolm felt lighter as he left the bank, but he also knew that the real fight was just starting that evening. He sat in front of his TV watching the news. Rebecca had been honest about her words. The tale was given in full, replete, with video of the bank interviews with locals from the area and snippets of Malcolm elucidating precisely what had transpired. The face emerged on the screen. The reaction was instantaneous. Within hours, the narrative started to blossom on social media as people demanded action, asking that the bank answer actual responsibility for what had transpired. Hashtags like L of Justice for Malcolm and MCH Fire Collins arose. Rising as more news sources took up the narrative, Malcolm's phone buzzed with alerts. Friends, relatives, even strangers reached out to give support, many sharing similar tales of prejudice, but one letter stood out as a declaration from the bank's corporate office. First National Bank does not accept discriminatory acts in any form. We are conducting an internal assessment and have suspended Mr. Jeffrey Collins, awaiting further. Malcolm read the statement twice. It was a start, but he will take suitable action depending on the results of the review. We are dedicated to treating all of our clients with respect and dignity. Wasn't happy yet. Jeffrey had been suspended. Malcolm wanted him gone permanently. He grabbed his phone and quickly messaged Rebecca to keep the pressure on. By the end of the week, the bank was attempting to wait this out. Obliged to provide another statement this time, more direct after finishing our internal inquiry. We regret the situation and are acting after Mr. Jeffrey Collins left First National Bank. We regret to Mr. Malcolm Avery and will be providing further training for all staff members to avoid prejudice. Malcolm read the statement carefully, allowing the words sink, thus ensuring that such an occurrence never occurs again. Jeffrey was gone, and his efforts to humiliate Malcolm had backfired spectacularly. Now he was the one suffering public disgrace. It was not just a triumph for Malcolm, but a statement. To anybody who felt they could get away with the same type of conduct, he slumped back in his chair, feeling a sense of pleasure come over him. He had done it, he had fought back, and he had won the news coverage continuous with Rebecca. Doing a follow-up interview, stressing the bank's choice and the more general problems of racism in establishments like this one, the narrative had evolved from Malcolm's experience to become part of a more general dialogue. Though more fights to fight had to be done, for now he let himself appreciate this moment of justice. Malcolm stood outside the same glass doors he had been kicked out of only a week earlier, sparkling in the sunshine, yet everything seemed different. The weight of injustice that had crushed down on him was gone, replaced by a peaceful pleasure. The battle had been hard, the effort grueling, but now he was returning on. His own terms taking a deep breath, Malcolm pushed open the doors and entered the bank's atmosphere. A far cry from the busy talk that had filled the room the day he had first come in, he could feel eyes on him bank. Employees and a few patrons recognized him from the television coverage, but today was about closure. Malcolm approached the counter and saw Jeffrey Collins, the previous manager, standing by his desk in. The guy who had stood so confidently above Malcolm was now reduced to this packing-up impotent. His face was pale, drawn with despair, as he painstakingly packed his stuff. Though her eyes dilated somewhat as he recognized who had just stepped in Malcolm, Malcolm strolled over to the counter where Angela stood and seemed more at ease than he had seen. She greeted him with a gentle, "What can I do for you today?" Malcolm returned her smile, but his attention was already focused on Jeffrey, who had spotted his presence. The manager's hand stopped over the box for a while. Her voice mixed warmth and remorse. Jeffrey knew it. He knew there was no escaping from what had transpired. Malcolm remarked, his tone calm but stern. "The one I wasn't able to deposit last time." His eyes narrowed. Angela nodded immediately, already processing the transaction. "Of course," she replied. "I'll take care of it right now." Malcolm handed over the check, the identical check that had begun everything. Malcolm turned, slightly faced Jeffrey. Now continuing seeing the drama develop, the tension in the air was high, and the other staff members appeared to feel keeping their heads down and acting not to notice for a minute. Neither man spoke. Then Malcolm took a step closer. His eyes never left Jeff. "Well, look at you," Malcolm remarked, his voice casual but filled with delight. "Looks like you have your hands full." Jeffy's jaw tensed, but he maintained his focus. Malcolm nodded slowly, pretending to check the half-packed box on the desk. "I heard that it turns out that accusing somebody of fraud without justification doesn't really mean much. I'm packing up," he remarked simply. "Your goal was to embarrass me," Malcolm replied, lifting an eyebrow. "Your job was to kick me out and call the police for no cause." That's why Jeffy's eyes flared with rage, but he held his calm. Malcolm leaned in slightly. His voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "No, you followed your own racial preconceptions, and see where it got you packing." Your hands curled into fists at his sides. "Your desk until I pay this check." He let the words linger in the air, watching as Jeffrey's face hardened with resentment. Malcolm had no need to shout or gloat loudly. The sight of Jeffrey robbed of his authority was victory enough. "I told you this wasn't over. You should have listened." Jeffy's lips twisted into a grim line. You think this is some major victory for you. You think you have changed anything." Malcolm smiled, a little warning calm, but sincere grin. "It's about making people like you responsible, not about changing the world." "Yeah, this feels like a victory to me." Just then, Angela arrived to the counter, handing Malcolm a receipt and the cash for his. She spoke, her voice softly, but with a little feeling of satisfaction as well. She realized the importance of this moment. Malcolm took the money, placing it into his pocket, turned back to Jeffrey. "One last time," his grin fading into something more serious. "Maybe you'll think carefully next time before presuming someone like me doesn't belong, if there even is. A next time with that." Malcolm turned and headed toward the exit, his head held high as he opened the glass doors and out into the sunshine. He seemed lighter than he had in days. He had fought against the guy who had sought to tear him down, and he had had won not only for himself, but for... After Jeffrey Collins was left standing in the bank, packing the last of his belongings, everyone who had ever been in his shoes behind him knew that the man he had sought to destroy had brought about his fall from grace few weeks before. Malcolm's last visit to the bank marked the beginning of the turmoil surrounding the event, gradually calming the media. Moved on to other tales, and although Malcolm still sometimes got letters of encouragement the planet had, kept turning Malcolm on his front porch, seeing the sun set below the horizon and create a pleasant glow. Golden glow over the area he drank his coffee in, his method of decompressing after another demanding day at work. Though the weight he had been carrying from that day at the bank had dropped, the memory of it remained a reminder. Understanding exactly how delicate dignity may be in the face of authority, he looked down at his phone, where a news item on the newly adopted anti-discrimination rules from the bank flashed across the screen they had been compelled to act upon, rapidly undergoing fresh training. For every staff member, and reviewing their policies, the bank's reputation had been damaged, and they were flitting around to correct it. But to Malcolm, it was about much more than simply the policies or the corporate apologies. Though he had been compelled to face the world head-on, something he had always known was not always fair, particularly not to people like him. He had always been conscious of the challenges, the covert judgments about what he might and couldn't do. But now, after everything he had gone through, felt more secure of his position in a society that sometimes attempted to drive him from his dreams, returned to the instant he came face to face with Jeffrey Collins in that bank he had always known. Men like Jeffrey were those who assumed the worst merely because of their want to see him fail rather than thrive. Hue of his skin. Yet for once Malcolm had been able to flip the odds. He had held his ground, fought back, and walked out with his dignity intact. He had not found it easy there. There have been times when he considered leaving, about releasing. It goes. But he had pushed forward. For every individual who had ever been forced to, not just for himself. Felt like they didn't fit. And finally it had been worth it, not just because Jeffrey had been let go, but also because Malcolm had shown something to the world and to himself. Hence it was not about the check or even the bank it used. Regarding the battle against the denial, to allow someone else define his value, Malcolm drank another sip of his coffee, experiencing. The warmth enveloped him. He had come out from this more certain in who he was and what he could do there. Would be other conflicts. Definitely. This wouldn't be the last time someone attempted to fit him into a box, instructing him he didn't belong. But now he knew he had the will to resist each time the sun sank below the horizon. Malcolm got up and felt the cool breeze wash over his pocket. He grabbed his phone and noted the news words. Though he always had work to do, article already fading from his thoughts, let himself relax tonight. Had fought the struggle and emerged triumphant. For now, that was enough.